Welcome to The Forest for the Trees. I'm Ross Hunsinger. Cannabis today is both more global and accessible than ever before, but it's important to remember that geographic isolation and a great deal of work being done behind closed doors are what brought us where we are today. Countries that produce traditional hash have always drawn a very distinctive type of seeker to them, and our guest today is one of the most distinctive around. Frenchy Cannoli is a cultural force in cannabis, and not just because he's named Frenchy Cannoli. Frenchy seeks to educate, inspire, and connect this modern world of cannabis to its foundation in far-flung fields and closely knit communities. In the most genuine, least marketing-oriented way, Frenchy uses his platform to connect the truly passionate to the things he is most passionate about, and it transmits with stunning clarity. Here's our interview with Frenchy Cannoli. All right, we are here, David Heldreth and Frenchy Cannoli. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Tell the people, what is a Frenchy Cannoli?
Frenchy Cannoli is a traditional hash maker. I call myself a hashishin from some Afghan friend I had in the 80s who told me that in Afghanistan, a hashishin is a resin devotee, for a better word, somebody devoted to quality resin. So
you are the embodiment, the French embodiment
of
a resin hunter.
Traditional culture I share when I was younger, traveling in producing country, basically. And I added the science behind the traditional tech I learned.
Tell us about where you come from. Where does it start?
Where did it start? It started when I was really young, reading adventures of Marco Polo, Burton, Thousand and One Night, Kipling. And I always dreamed of traveling. That's what I really wanted to do. When I was in my young teenage years, I even spent time with gypsies. They were my neighbor in the winter. And I wished to have the freedom they had, to be able to not be in the same place every day, just to have like something new every day. And when I was 18, that's what I did. The fact that I started to smoke a little bit before that pretty much guided my choice in country, but smoking hash was connecting with a lot of stories I read when I was a kid. The Thousand and One Night, it's one of the first literature where they actually talk about hashish and eating hashish. So it was really having the experience of the taste and smell of those country, and that may have been the last triggers that pushed me to leave behind a normal 9-to-5 Western life.
So you romanticize that much and finally coming in contact with it.
Yes, for sure.
That's a pretty profound experience. for you to change your whole trajectory to that point to pursue what you have. Yeah,
I would have traveled nonetheless. I think I would have given anything when I was young just to travel. Smoking hash put it in a different perspective, because first I became a pariah. I became the scum of the world, while I was really feeling joy smoking hash, and that much more pressure in my life, I think, really just pushed me to get out of it. And then when you travel in producing country, in all hashish producing country, it's part of the culture. So it's kind of, you don't feel like doing something really, really wrong. It's, there is a culture behind. It's still illegal, but it's manageable, because it's all a question to deal with the police and a little bakshish under the table. And then I came to India, and India, it's become spiritual. It's a religion. It's like cannabis was born in a drop of the elixir of life. It's a big deal. And then I came to California, and I discovered the medical aspect of it. So it's like my relation with the plant went from a a teenager first love to something much more spiritual, and then coming here to the States, it just locked down everything, and it became everything in my life, more or less. Huh?
With France being so close to Morocco, was that one of the first places you went for the traditional aspect? I mean, was that like early?
Yes. I mean, the whole Mediterranean basin, and my best friend were Moroccan, Lebanese, Persian. So it's like it's all part of the
French
of
diaspora.
The culture, yeah. And the Mediterranean Sea, it's a smuggling place. It's like the first boat must have been smuggling something, and since the first ship was born, they've been smuggling on the Mediterranean Sea. Still is like cigarette, alcohol, you name it, everything.
I love port cities for that reason. Like you get that, we're in Seattle now, you get that sense too. There's like a teeming underworld of things coming in and out. Good.
It's rich of different culture, and I love it too.
Totally. That has to speak to a guy that's got the traveling feet, itchy feet, wants to go everywhere. How long have you been working in the United States?
In the industry, maybe 8 years now, something like that.
Doing a lot of consulting work.
At the beginning was more giving my name and having my name registered. That was a little pushing the limit. To be able to grow at home. My daughter wasn't home anymore, so I didn't have that fear anymore. My daughter was an adult. To be able to smoke, and then from that, under peer pressure, I started to trim my flower. And because I trimmed my flower, I started to make hash for myself with it. And then I showed my hash for the first time in a dispensary because I wanted to smoke them out to thank them for a cannabis event where they were involved or something like that. And I realized that what I was doing and what I learned in producing country had nothing to do with the market, the concentrate market in California. And,
I'm sure you blew their mind.
In a way, yes, but on the other side, 8 years ago, nobody wanted to buy my hash. Nobody wanted to buy pressed dark black hash. That was like the worst you can put on the market. And I wouldn't give unpressed resin because for me it's like selling grape and not making wine out of the grape. So it's like was something really like I was stuck into it. There is no way I just put an unpressed resin on the market. So to be able to make a difference, my only way was to be able to get in direct contact with the people and to smoke them out. So I went to every cannabis event in California. I would camp in a 215 section, smoke people out, and give piece of hash to everybody who wanted to try a traditional hash, basically. And 8 years later, Frenchy Cannoli is the hash god. And
why do you think some of the benefits of the traditional methods are compared to these other products?
Well, so in a concentrate world, it goes from just like sieved resin to the pure isolate. Everything in between is a concentrate. Then into those concentrates, you have what is sieved. That means that you collect the whole resin head, and you have what is extracted. When you extract the resin from its matrix, from the resin head that created it, which is very much like extracting juice from a fruit. The juice is the fruit, but everything that created that juice, that sugar, that goodness, you leave it behind. So it's like you leave behind a huge part of the equation. When you extract the resin from the resin head, well, you do the same. You leave behind what created those 100 plus cannabinoids, and it happened only in those resin head. You leave behind something huge. Then when you press those resin head into a mass of resin that is called hashish, you create a new compound that have elements that are corrosive. Terpene is corrosive, and resin to a certain point. That means that everything, that matrix that is part of that mass of resin is going to be absorbed by the resin and the terpene and become part of it. So that there is a chemical reaction happening and a transformation of your resin head into another product. And that product you can age. And aging will cut down on the sharpness of the taste. It's going to become smooth, and it get a body very much like a wine. When you smoke a fresh ash that is pretty new, your mouth fill up with the taste of whatever you smoke. It starts in the front, and slowly it fill up your mouth and take all your mouth. When you smoke aged ash, it takes your mouth full, and then the taste comes from behind. That means that you have already a whole taste in your mouth, and you have all those elements that what took your mouth coming slowly one after the other, but from the back. It's,
back.
I don't know, it's very difficult to explain, but it's very, very different experience, and it packs a punch. It's really strong.
It's interesting to hear that. Actually, at one point in time, the founder of True Terpenes, Chris, was very, very interested in pursuing the aged hash route, and in one of our facilities in Portland had cedar-lined rooms ready to go for it, because this was exactly where the mind was at. But again, it's interesting to see where the American hash market is at and what the demand for it is, and the nomenclature, the way people market things as what they are or are not. And I know that's something you're working with too, is the standardized nomenclature and vocabulary for hash.
But if here the whole hash world was brought back by people like Nicati from Essential Extract, and the name of the game was to mimic an extract, so that you could compete on the market. So they don't make hash. They collect resin and they present it in a way that is that can be competitive to an extract. And even the vocabulary they use is made up to be compatible, for a better word, with the vocabulary used into in extract industry. So you cannot use ice water and say that it's a solventless methodology, because water is a universal solvent, for example. Outside that, you really have to make a difference between dry sieve, ice water sieving, because ice water, it's still sieving. You do not extract the resin from the resin head. I do use mechanical force to agitate my plant to break away the resin head from their stock. But at the end of the day, I collect them in a sieve bag, a tool that is made of perforation. And through those perforation, I can reach certain cleanliness or certain get access to certain size. So it's still sieving. Then you go into the extraction world. So first you have non-solvent extraction, like the rosin, which is not as simple and basic as I thought, because now you can literally extract pure THCA. If they extract pure THCA, they can extract pure CBD. It's just a question of plant. If they can extract pure CBD, they can extract pure CBC, if the plant produces CBC, or pure THCV. Like you get into some serious extraction. They can do sauce, and they just started to touch what can be done by mechanical separation. It's pretty trippy. Mm-hmm. And then you go into solvent extraction. anything from butane, propane, ethanol, isopropyl, all that, it's an extraction where, again, you use a solvent to dissolve the material and takes all the compound from the material. So you cannot really say that an extract is hashish. Hashish is the word that is 1,200 years old. If I compare a little bit to wine, you can extract alcohol from grape juice. Okay? But wine is not an alcohol. Wine is not a distillation byproduct. Wine is made by fermentation. So it's its own entity. Well, hashish is the same, and I would like people, if they don't respect tradition, at least to understand and respect what hashish is by its own characteristics, so that you cannot really compare it to any other type of extract.
And which you've started to do, like, again, by...
I've been fighting hard for it. You have no idea how difficult it is for the people to understand that ice water is not an extraction. And I'm really anal about it, because water is the only true evolution in a methodology that is at least as old as agriculture. That's 15,000 years. It's a pretty big deal. Yeah. You know what I mean? So if you don't understand that you're sieving when you use ice water, you think that you're doing an extraction, because you don't have the definition of the word that is your methodology, you cannot be on point, because you actually don't know exactly what you're doing to a point. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. No, that's kind of one of the themes that people we talk with on this show, one of the themes that recurs frequently is the stewardship through periods of time and through history, whether it's the plant itself and pre-legalization, the culture that people are trying to carry through now and represent farmers well and the plant well, and the big business of cannabis and stuff. And in modern extracts too, and hydrocarbon extracts or CO2, there are people that, like, again, giving respect due to farmers and the cultivation side and things. But again, I think what we keep finding is these people that we're drawn to speaking with are these stewards that say, like, this is the standard that I'm setting, because you have that opportunity now, and with modern legalization, this early wave of legalization, say, I am Frenchy Cannoli, I am the expert on this, and here is why. So it's a hard fight, but it's also a pretty distinct opportunity, right?
It's nice to be able to say, I work in the cannabis industry, I'm a hashishin, that's what I do, to be able to research, to be able to have access to scientists and ask questions. It's very, very rewarding, because you need that knowledge behind what we do to be able to push the game further.
Are you still learning?
Writing?
Learning. Do you still learn?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the day you stop learning, or you have lost track of what life is, or you're dead.
I mean, I kind of knew the answer. That was a baited question. I thought I knew the answer prior, which I did. But that's it. Is you have a spark, and that's kind of it. It's like you will always, since your childhood, you've always been pursuing this, and you always will pursue it. And I think that's a part of the special sauce that you have too. Yeah.
Difficult to say. It's like, it's just being able to do something that bring you joy. Basically, to be able to wake up every morning and to be happy to start your day. It was when I was traveling, it was when I was a dad, and now getting older, to be able to have this in my life that really pumped me up. Yeah, I'm super grateful to Denis Perron, Jack Herer, and all the people that actually gave me that ability, that freedom to share what is most precious in my life.
How do you think this new market that you're allowed to participate in now as legalization happens? You mentioned being almost a villain in the past. How do you think that? What do you think caused that shift, or how does that affect you?
Legalization, as much as I was pro, not because of what it would bring to California specifically, but what impact it would have on the world market. For me, it's way beyond California. California, for me, it's very special because it could become what France is to the wine industry. It could become the only place in the world where a country, a production is dedicated to quality. Every producing country in the world is dedicated to quantity. They have been doing quantity for thousands and thousands of years. There is nobody on the planet dedicated to quality. It would be really nice that America stand for that. It's not going there, though. Huh?
I don't know. I honestly,
There are small farmers, but yeah.
This is a hot take too, but I've said this long term. I think the United States will be an agricultural market. I don't think we're going to be a huge market of consumption, but I think because of the agricultural standards and kind of where things are, we do have a unique opportunity to be a state or a country that does export and produce in great quantities.
Yeah, no, but it's like producing quantities, it's not as easy. And producing swag in quantity is not a solution.
No. And
okay? It's like California is known the world over for its quality, or I could almost put it in the past, was known the world over for its quality. That means that NorCal is known for its quality. And like Bordeaux, to be able to create, to define a terroir and to put appellation d'origine on that terroir, you don't have to prove that there is a cannabis terroir. You have to rely on that acknowledgement of quality that is worldwide. From that acknowledgement of quality, you go and define the terroir in the specific place that produce that agricultural product.
Totally.
So that means that in your hand you have everything to really start like the French, like the wine industry with the highest standard of quality, something that doesn't exist. That means that you can create every standard, every vocabulary. How do you buy flour? Like one of my breeder, when he tell me that his flour tastes like lime pop, well, I have never tried a lime pop. Okay? The guy had to make me taste a lime pop for me to relate to his flour. So when he's going to sell his flour to Japan, to Italy, to France, lime pop is not going to cut it. You need a word that define exactly the terpene profile, like when you buy cigar, like when you buy coffee, like when you buy wine. There is a vocabulary. Each word is understood by everybody so that you can get exactly what you want. And that's something we really need to create beyond a categorization of the product. Then there is a description of the characteristic of the product so that it could be ordered from abroad.
We'll have our own Châteauneuf du Pape soon, like in American export quality, right?
You have things that are as tasty as Châteauneuf du Pape. It's amazing the amount of strains that produce so many different terpene profiles that are unique to that specific plant and cannot be mimicked by any means. It's national treasure to a certain point. It's like whatever the Western medicine is going to do with the cannabinoid and the terpene, they will never be able to give exactly what the plant gives, which is pretty bon.
What do you think your favorite cultivar is, or do you have one?
No, I have many, and because I'm discovering one every day, it's very difficult to have favorite. I spent my life with 6 flavors before coming to the States. You had Morocco, Lebanon, Central Asia, Persia, like Turkey, Iran. You had Pakistan, Afghanistan, which is a little similar, especially when you have all that chitral part, which is a border part. And then you had India, Nepal, with a little bit more nuance. That's it.
Interesting. Could you describe what some of those differences might be? between even those? Because I think a lot of people in the United States never get to experience that.
And I think, honestly, too, just to touch into it, too, like, I think a lot of Americans look at the American starred hash scale as the standard for what hash is and how they fall and are graded and things, right?
Yeah,
Which, again,
you play soccer, you're playing American football. The rest of the world is playing soccer.
100%.
So
Like,
when you're going to want to play with everybody,
Yeah.
well, you're going to have to adapt.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I am curious. Like, do break down some of that, because again, this is all, I think, for a lot of our audience too. We're speaking to people that maybe haven't had contact with brick pressed, old school, real hash. They've only seen dispensary hash, which again we're talking. So yeah, like run through some of those basic differences. Again, there's 6 types there, but.
But yeah, I learned that what I smoked when I was young actually had a high CBD content. So, like, for example, my favorite is the red Lebanese. It's like smoking a red Lebanese hash. It's something that I was 18 years old. I'm 63, 62. And it's one of the most rewarding experience I ever had smoking. It's maybe because it was at the beginning also, but it has like a taste of spice and earth and sweetness to it that it's really hard to describe, and it's unique. It's something, and the stuff was according to some scientific study done on a bust in Israel over a period of 15 years or something. It seems that the Lebanese would be one-on-one, basically, and I was smoking hash that was 4% THC. Alors, don't ask me how I could feel a 4% THC, because I can't believe it. And that paper was based only on THC, CBD, and CBN, nothing else, which is super interesting because it really shows how much everything else, how much the entourage effect actually mean in the wholeness of the psychoactive and medicinal effect, I imagine.
Definitely. It makes me curious. I mean, I can't remember if it was earlier you mentioned some people have been talking about CBC in some of these talks, or CBG, or even like you mentioned earlier, the terpenes. It is really interesting to see how something that low would have such a strong effect, but it totally makes sense. I've had just profiles that have no cannabinoids, and that's affected me, so I can definitely see that happening.
It was really interesting to learn about, because it was like a little bit after my time, but not that much, that new genetic were in Morocco and stuff like that. And the stuff coming from India, I know really well. And I know Israeli are really connected up in the mountain. So they are not bringing just the low quality. And the highest level of THC, it's what comes from India, and it's in 14%, even 14%. That's not really. You need a lot of terp with the flower at 14% to be happy. You know what I mean? But it's that wholeness of the cannabinoid and terpene that make it really like something unique. And I would give anything to walk some, to smoke some of the jungle wild cannabis I was making in India. Anything I make here, it's like, it's nice, but it doesn't have that power. I don't know how to say it. I don't know. It was maybe also to smoke it and make it in India where you're, but I do the same here, so I don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you don't lack the connection.
Like India was, Charas had an impact of me because I had smoked only hash before, which is like dry and cure resin, and then I smoke live resin. There is a huge difference in the whole experience, the whole feel. It's super speedy and active. It's like India was a big. I never went back to make hash in a hash producing country. Actually,
on that, how many countries have you worked in where you've produced different processes?
I never really counted, to tell you the truth.
Stylistically, have you gone through and checked off like
No, I'm not the style. I'll count how many countries I visited when I stopped visiting country, I guess.
Huh.
I'm not the type to keep a list or... No, traveling for me was being in a place where I don't know nothing and nobody, where everything is foreign, so that your senses are really full, 100% active. And then it's when you live like that on a daily basis, it's something that you need. You need that much input to feel it. I don't know how to explain it.
I gotta ask, just because I'm so curious now too, because you mentioned it earlier too. When you were raising your daughter, did this whole lifestyle just kind of go dark?
I was a dad.
You were just a dad.
I was a restaurant manager.
You're shitting me.
And only the guy, who was taking care of the flower, my dealer, knew I was smoking.
Yeah.
Nobody knew. My daughter didn't know about it until she was
she's like, who the
almost
hell is
20.
Cannoli? Awesome. See, that's super interesting, and like that has to be incredibly rewarding, because there have been times in my life where I've rolled the shutters up on, my pot or whatever, my honesty with people about my pot use or whatever. So congratulations for making it to the other side of that. That's got to be a huge liberation.
It was. I mean, it was okay because I had such a strong family life. My daughter and my wife were enough for me at that time. Everything was, all my life, social life was super superficial. Because I couldn't talk about my experience to nobody. They would look at us like, whoa. And when my daughter left, where I really felt like I was back into my tribe, like the people I knew when I was traveling and stuff, it's when I went to the mountain. When I connected with a farmer, it was like, yes, I'm home. It's like, this is a place I can connect. Those people I know, that's the same. They don't travel, but it's that same, I don't know, type of life.
It's funny, I was discussing this with my wife earlier, actually, that as insular as some people can come off as, or isolated, cloistered, even in an urban setting, when you're walking down the street, people really do like to connect with other people. Like, that's a true human thing. So especially when you connect with a cloistered or separated group, like, I think those are really profound connections that you make, no? Yeah.
What was the experience you had in your youth with the gypsies? Like, I mean, you mentioned that, and I think that probably framed a lot of your...
I was a kid. I lived in the middle of nowhere in Brittany, and in the summer, the place between my house and the beach and the sea was a camping ground for tourists, and in the winter they were family of gypsies that passed by most winter, and I would go to school with the kid, and they were my playmate, and so I would eat with their family. I mean, I would be part of their camp, and it's like, as a kid I was tripping already on traveling. Those kids had the freedom that was amazing compared to my life. It's like, but I didn't really understand the responsibilities they had to at the same time. So it's like, when they're kid, gypsy are king. They can do everything they want. Really, like, we played throwing stone at each other, like, and we'd hurt each other like bad. My mom would flip out on stuff like that. The gypsy family, they were cool. They would patch you up, and it's like each kid playing a little rough, no problem. You know what I mean? Like a bunch of puppies that bite each other. And that type of freedom, that type of understanding is like when you're a kid and you feel like... your parents are really overbearing on you. It's like you get beaten at school to learn stuff. It's like that type of freedom. Nobody was going to touch those kids.
And Brittany is like a pretty idyllic place too. Like, it's very
Yeah, I mean, that place was magnificent. I lived like 3 miles from the closest village, which was like 20 kilometers for the closest city, and on the coast with dune, blockos from the last war, swamp, farm, forest, lake.
What did your parents do?
My dad was forest specialist in Africa when I was a kid.
Is that part of where you're
I
lust
grew
for
up a
travel?
little. I don't know. I grew up a little bit in Africa. I was born in France, but they brought me in Africa straight up, and I was too much over and full, so they had to send me back to France after a few years. But we lived in Gabon. With a place with no road, you had like 4 or 5 hours of small boats to go there.
Nothing is as grand as it used to be. And I know that things are more convenient now as a consequence, but a loss there is that it's not as grand. And I like hearing that, like trips by boat to get there, and like it's.
Yeah, but there is still. I mean, if you go and
I
get
guess
lost,
you can still get a boat. Yeah, just take a boat if you want to.
If you really go and get lost, there is still places like that in the world. It's like now there is so much tourism that was born from us traveling in the 60s and 70s that it really changed the planet. So, to the point where if you really like a place, you don't want to talk about it.
Totally.
Because 10 years later, there is an airport. It's totally destroyed.
Do you feel similarly about the cannabis industry as we kind of circle back to that whole like pre and post legalization thing?
No, because cannabis is bigger than everything. It's just the way we approach it that is sad. It's like in Colorado, when you see all those farmers producing those vast amount of CBD, American people talking about growing CBD in China, and then not understanding that actually hemp is being breeded over 10,000 years minimum, because the oldest archaeological find is 10,000 years old. So you know that it's at least 25,000 years old. That plant has been breeded not to produce cannabinoid, but fiber and seeds. That you extract CBD from the plant, fine. But that's only icing on the cake. You don't do nothing with the fiber. Shame on you, because we are supposed to save the planet with that. So everybody is investing into those huge CBD factory, and there is nobody who's bringing the infrastructure to do anything with the stock. It's like, that's where the money is actually.
I literally said that on our last show.
It's crazy. It's like not even paper. They don't even do paper.
No.
They do
I
pellets.
think
With
it's
how
coming.
quick-
The Farm Bill just got passed, so maybe now that that's completely
But
legal, we'll see it.
I'm
I
with
hope you're
Frenchie,
right.
man. Like if we've been spooling up these millions of acres of biomass and whatever, like we've seen the wave of the waste product coming. So why hasn't anybody been speculating and developing the processes on
Because
that?
they're
Like,
blinded by the cannabinoid and CBD. I mean, it's number 2. There is 130 plus cannabinoid. Can we go to number 3? Like,
yeah, true.
Exactly. I mean, yeah.
I mean,
or-
I get it. It's crazy, incredible, and all. But if you look at the study made in Israel to cure Crohn's disease, to have any effect on the Crohn's disease, you'd need 240 milligram dose. Okay,
I
2 or 3 times a day. At
not
the
5
prices,
milligrams in a chocolate for $30.
At the
Really?
price they're
Weird.
saying CBD, you're not going to be able to afford it, literally. And otherwise, it's like all those amazing results that you have from CBD. Well, a lot of it is pure placebo effect. It's nice. But we could do so much better if we were not really stuck into that legalization, trying to maximize money on the farmer so that you don't even nurture them. You literally destroy and kill them.
Everything
And-
has gone to the processor, which again, like hash is amazing, but it's you respect the plant and the farmer, and that's what you're bringing to the table. And I don't think, as you said, these other people aren't really, that's not where it's going.
But all of us, it's like, I'm a winemaker. You don't give me the good grape, I don't make the wine. When I travel in producing country, people kind of appreciated that I made the ash, but the question were, where did you go to make it? How high? How far? That's the value of the ash. It's the genetic and that specific place where it grows. So when you're in India, you can make ash at 1,000 feet in a valley, or you can go to 10,000 and do the same. Well, but the result is not going to be quite the same. So it's never really the guy who made the resin. It's where did you go? So when I came to NorCal, it was the same. It was the land and the climate and the genetic. But the genetic, there is a breeder there behind. So it changed a little bit the fact. And then behind the flowers, there is always a farmer also here, which in producing country, they farm, but they just break the ground at the raining season and throw the seeds. That's basically it until they harvest. So you cannot really put the farmer behind.
Is it again, to use wine as an analog, is it like a récoltant system where like it bulk lands and you buy lots of whatever in other producing countries?
No, it's like I'm dependent on the quality of the resin as much as a winemaker is dependent on the amount of sugar and juice formed inside the grape. That means that I need perfection to be able to do greatness.
But you're removed from the cultivator in those places. Or the cultivator
because it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
It's more
it
just
doesn't
wild.
exist. It's like
wild? Is it just wild in those
it's
places?
not wild, but it's you just break the ground and throw the seeds basically during the raining season, and be careful that the goat don't get into the field. That's it.
Interesting.
In Lebanon, a bit different. They actually use plant and use like machinery to do it. But Lebanon is a very special place also.
Interesting. It's interesting to hear that even in these traditional places, that there's still a great amount of diversity in terms of what they're doing. It's not like each of these countries is doing the same thing. They're all different.
Well, like you say too, it's so rooted in the culture. Like it's a culture thing. So there are all these different iterations, just like food and drink and the rest of it, right? They're
And
deeply
it's
rooted.
like it's culturally a little bit the same, but it's different. In a methodology, the details, the way they smoke, and all that. While there is common point like pressing with a source of heat, curing the flower minimum 3 to 6 months before you actually sieve to collect the resin, and stuff like that are common. Otherwise, the tool and the way to process is a bit different in every country.
You mentioned uses. I guess, what are some of the ways people smoke hash that you don't commonly see in the United States?
Well, everything that is smoked in producing country is not smoked here. Huh?
And actually, like this is a question that I asked because we got a hold of some nice hash. And we were like, what vessel do we offer Frenchy cannoli to smoke hash from? So I'm curious to know, what is your preferred method of
So to smoke pure, I use a 3-hole bowl. It's like a flower bowl, but instead of having the hole at the bottom is a nice little curve, and you have 3 holes on top of the bowl. So and I put the ash there on a rig, and I use a wand or a little herb iron to heat my resin. That's one of my favorites to really test it. Then pure, it will be the hookah. The hookah, because I have that new superb bowl made by some French guys. It's amazing. Like you have the quartz bowl where I put the ash, and on top of it you have a kind of aluminium 2 parts containment chamber where you put your hot coal, you close it, and then you put it on top of your bowl.
Great.
And the heat is spread specific, like in a certain way in that top, that heat the air that is in the quartz chamber, and the ash is vaporized, not really combust because it just bubble. You don't, it doesn't really burn. It's just combust, between combustion and vaporization. And the taste is amazing. Like I have, it's been one of the greatest birthday presents I have ever received. Like
That's awesome.
I'm gonna have to find one of those.
Otherwise, the chillum, but I put tobacco in a chillum,
Yeah. That's very French of
which
you.
I'm supposed to stop.
I think there's a lot of people who are in that boat. It seems also part of the tradition as well, is the combination of nicotine and tobacco and
I mean,
cannabis.
the nicotine, flower, and ash, it's stronger than just flower and ash. It's like the tobacco brings something to the table. That's for sure.
Interesting.
You're getting off microphone, just a sour look. I'm in that same boat that I was actually like, part of me was hoping when I asked what your favorite method was, I was hoping just going to say, oh, just roll it into Gaulois or something like that. Like
A good spliff.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
But now the spliff, it's like it's very hard for me to smoke only tobacco and ash. I do it rarely, and I do it really for specific ash that I really want to test. Otherwise, I put a lot of flour with the ash, a tiny bit of tobacco, and I use the tip of the cigarette as a filter.
Interesting. I'd heard that potentially it was hookah, and as we're in the hotel, I was like, I don't know if we can set up the hookah rig in the hotel. Maybe next time, though. I wondered though about that coal, because that was my question, is what the heat method was. So it was interesting to hear that somebody has contained the coal and figured that all out.
Before that, I would I had a bowl that was like a donut.
Okay.
So you put the hole was in the middle. You put the ash in the round part, and because I didn't want the coal to be directly on a resin, I will use a pasta strainer in metal to put my coal here, and I would hold
Like hover it, yeah.
over the donut part and blowing it or making sure that the coal stay red for smoking. It works super well, but I burn the ash. It's like at the end, the test.
Do you DIY everything? Do you like to make everything yourself? Are you a process guy, I guess is my question.
Yeah. I like my tool. I especially when I do stuff that are specific. I really like to have something adapted to what I do.
Specific use. Yeah, totally. An evolved, yeah.
So,
I think I've got a similar madness of my own. So there's like things that I'm picking up on. Like, yes, I get this. I understand.
I guess that's why I have my custom bag. I made my own custom machine, and then I want custom mold. I have custom support for my bag. It's like everything that I use, it has to be custom made because I had to adapt to the tool I was using. It's like, okay, my sieve is a bag now. Okay, a bag is not convenient whatsoever to rinse inside. If I need two hands to hold it, I'm gonna need a third person to do the rinsing. So I made frame to hold my bag so that I can hold my bag with one hand and work with the other, like little detail like that I do because of the logic behind and because it makes my the way I work sharper. Quoi.
Well, and it also makes it your own too. The more you come to know a process and then make it your own, that is again representative only of you. The only time we would ever have hash that would be like is if it comes from you, right?
Yeah, I guess in a way, yeah.
Yeah, that's the wonderful artistry that kind of gets to shine through. I think that's pretty cool.
It's craft, huh? It's like when you're a craftsman. Before coming to the States, I was really good at what I did, but I had no knowledge whatsoever of the resin head. But I wasn't considering myself as a craftsman. It's like all those years, spending 3-4 months every season to make my hash for the year smoking was like normal. I mean, it's like was not a pastime per se, but I don't know. It's like I don't really have it had value, but I didn't see it as a craft. When I started to see it as a craft here, as a craftsman, there is a product and there is a tool and nothing else in your life. But the product defines the tool. I didn't know the product. I had never seen a macro of a resin head. I didn't know what I was working with. So that knowledge, that scientific knowledge that I acquired of the resin head made me fine-tune the tool I needed to be able to work in perfect condition. Quoi.
And then you're kind of bringing a lot of this, in addition to this podcast, but to the masses. I mean, you're here in Seattle for a class, correct?
Yes, I'm here for a class tomorrow.
Can you kind of describe what you're going to be teaching by any chance, or what? And what do you think people are going to get? Like, what do you hope to teach them?
The love for the resin. No, it starts by the science behind everything I do, so that people really understand that everything I do, there is some pretty serious scientific reason behind. Once I go through that, I introduce the tool, and then I do a live demo. A live demo starts by working in the best condition, and then on purpose, I made a mistake where I put a lot of ice, a lot more time, I crush the material so that they can see a mistake made and see how much you need to do to make a mistake, actually. And then how to clean a mistake in a sieve. I explain them that when you dry sieve, you have two processes in one methodology. You have your tool, a big space of a material made of perforation, and you have your trim, your flour over it. You agitate those flowers, that material, to break the resin head. But at the same time that you do that, you separate on the material per size. So it's two processes in one methodology. When you use water, you can separate them. That means that any mistake I made into my agitation, I can compensate it in my bag by actually separating. And so I want people to really see that and show them how to get back into a non-mistake situation. And that's basically it. It's like when you know that you're making a mistake, you know when you're not making a mistake automatically. So you can build up that experience on that simple base.
Well, definitely. If they don't see something go wrong, then how are they going to know? Like, they may not even know that what they did was wrong.
Well, I mean, when you see green contaminant in your resin, it's because you made, like, the beauty of using water on top of being able to have two processes, two methodologies that you can fine tune. When you do dry sieve, the main elements that define quality is the cleanliness of the resin, because every time you touch, you create contaminant. The more you touch, the more contaminant. So your first pass is going to be the cleanest. Then you have to agitate a little stronger and stronger every time. You create contaminant. In the water, you don't. In the water, you need to crush a supple material to be able to do contaminant. You need to make a major mistake. Technically speaking, you cannot create contaminant. Every one of your wash is as clean as the other. Doesn't matter how many wash you do that plant.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you for the explanation.
What else you got coming in the pipeline? Lots more travel coming up?
A lot. We are going to go to Massachusetts for Valentine's Day. Then then there is March in Barcelona. Then there is Canada the month after. And then there is Berlin, Milan. It's getting bigger because I can do CBD hash.
Oh, yeah.
And then I also just wanted to mention all of your content's on YouTube, and you guys have a lot of open source stuff, so people can learn this stuff even if they can't make a class, right?
Yeah, I have I had the whole workshop filmed by professional with subtitles so that everybody can understand in 4 parts. The only thing they don't have is the science behind, because I keep learning more.
Oh, it makes sense.
So it's I'm not happy with the past one. I'm gonna have to do it again, but it's in writing actually. I'm doing the whole workshop in detail for WeedWorld in 5 parts, so that people can have it also in writing.
Cool.
Amazing. I think some people would probably love to see a video of any of your journeys at some point. If you ever get a camera crew to follow you, I think that would be a hit.
I agree. I'd watch that. I would 100% watch that.
Actually, I have a documentary. We're looking for somebody who would bring it to the public, basically.
Oh man, that's amazing.
And it started when we did those video for the workshop. At the same time, I wanted to my wife actually, Madame Canoli, wanted to do a promo, and I never had any promo, and we wanted to do a promo really super classy, like the Jiro Dream of Sushi. I don't know if you have ever seen
God,
it.
yes.
Something where like every gesture become like something incredible, every detail, you know what I mean, like showing really like the stuff I'm tripping when I make hash, basically. And from that, it went into chef table, where I needed to show as much my farmer for the people to get a connection. And then it started to be not only aficionado, but all the farmer I knew and was working with in the Emerald Triangle. And then it became a lot more about the farmer, pre-legalization, and now today, how the impact it has on them, quoi.
Well, I can't wait for that to come out in some form. So anyone listening, you guys should definitely get that.
Doug Riggs, just saying it right now.
Definitely. And if you guys have a chance, visit FrenchieDreamsOfHash.com, so that way you can catch some of these trailers. That way you can see what this would look like.
Yeah, and there's some of it's all of the YouTube content is there, right? Yeah, that's awesome. And your Instagram as well, people can follow along there.
Yes, you can also follow. Like everything I do or will do, basically, is shown on Instagram, and I use Instagram a lot for teaching also.
Cool.
To attract people to certain aspect of what I do, so that they by themselves go and try to dig deeper. Quoi.
Yeah. Man, thank you so much for taking the time to come out and talk with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's like genuinely our pleasure. There was like both of us are kind of nerds, so we were really excited.
I'm amazed that when you started that you had a hard time getting people to buy it. I think what's weird is like him and me are also just been in the cannabis industry a long time, and I think some of us that have that tradition kind of have looked up to you and other people making the traditional methods for a long time, and it's nice to see it finally getting back to you, and so you can benefit, because it's beautiful that you've kept that alive.
No, it's going to be greater when I bring it back to the people who gave it to me, because
and that's
now,
the best answer.
Because of IG, I talk to people in the Bekaa Valley and I teach them how to press. The village in the middle of nowhere at 8,000 feet in the Himalaya, you needed 2 days to walk there. To the closest to civilization and a bus and a market was 2-day walk. Now those people have an IG, and they want me to go back. It's like to go back to Morocco and be able to give back more knowledge that was given to me. That I think that's going to be the most rewarding of all.
That's pretty incredible to be that intermediary, like this global intermediary.
It is. I mean, it's. I hate the position because I had to become a role model, and I'm not. I am a Mediterranean with a bad temper. I wasn't a role model for my daughter in a certain way, because she know me well, and she know I'm wild, and she wouldn't use me as a role model for most things. So it's like it made me more aware of my behavior. And it's like it's a kind of responsibility that I can take, but at the same time it's a little difficult to be seen as much more than who I am. I'm just a guy. I'm not a god. I'm not a king. Everything I do, the value of what they see on Instagram, it's not me. It's my farmer. Everything I did in a mountain, it wasn't me. It's the resin growing there. I know I was crazy enough to go there, but it doesn't make me that special. You know what I mean? I appreciate the love, but I'm put off by the way people look at me. I'd like to see them to see me more. I'm a guy who shares the knowledge and's got more knowledge than them, and that's it.
Teacher.
It's like, to a point, yeah. Or even if it's not as a teacher, because they don't want to learn what I have to show. Somebody who represent a little bit the tradition and the qualities that they don't know about coming from producing country.
You're like the Tom Waits of cannabis. You're like this strange outlier of cannabis.
Here, yeah. The rest of the world, no.
Yeah, totally.
But here I'm French. I'm already a foreigner, so it all goes together in that type of image that they have of me.
We call that brand synergy here in the States, my friend.
Yeah,
you've got it. You've got it in spades. So, stay at it, man. Yeah, thanks again for coming in.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Our thanks to you once again for tuning in. The Forest for the Trees is a production of True Terpenes, and the views expressed are solely those of the hosts and guests. Our thanks to Adrian Walther and Phantoms for the intro and outro music. You can find their work on Soundstripe, and you can find us here every other Friday with another conversation about the ever-changing world of cannabis. From all of us here at True Terpenes and the Forest for the Trees, be well and do great things.